Side interests?
Well, I took up tennis during COVID, which was pretty brave at 52, and I actually can hit the ball. I'm not great, but I can, play a game. And mostly I focus on my two daughters, who are 13 and about to be 15.
Have you thought of hiring a consultant for your tennis game? If you hire a consultant, that would improve your tennis game, right?
Well, actually, most of the time I play tennis with a coach because that way I can actually hit the ball and get a little bit better.
Okay. So if the President of the United States called you and said, you're running a gigantic company, you've done a terrific job, I need some more women leaders in my government, why don't you come in and be secretary of something important? What would you say?
I'd say I'm honored to be asked, but I have really important work to do in the private sector.
Okay, so you wouldn't go in right now?
That is not my current aspiration.
Okay, now somebody who's watching this would say this person has an incredible professional life, rose up to be a partner at Cravath, now she's the CEO of this gigantic company. Can you cite something that didn't work out in your professional life so that people could feel you're not just a superhuman, and to make people feel good that they can see that somebody made a mistake? Did you have any mistakes you've made or failures that you can talk about?
David, people ask that question as if the only challenge is at work. And for me, work has been a great place. I've had a lot of success, and I don't have a spectacular failure. But in my own personal life, right, my father died when he was 68. I had breast cancer. We had drug addiction in our family, mental health issues. And so one of the things I've learned is that challenges come in a lot of different packages. And to have empathy for people, when someone has a bad day, you don't know if that bad day is because they've got something going on at home or in their personal life. And so my challenges haven't been about spectacular failures at work, but they have been challenges. And I talk about that because I think that's true for a lot of people.
Lots happening on Wall Street.
It's the basic law of economics.
The Fed is telling us this is transitory.
Need to catch up?
This is Bloomberg Wall Street Week. I'm David Weston.
We've got the information and insights.
David, you just hit the nail right on the head.
From businesses most influential and instrumental.
And that's the way you run good risk management.
We need to invest in our systems.
Bloomberg Wall Street Week premieres Friday with replays all weekend on Bloomberg Television and Radio.
How is Ireland dealing with that blackout risk, those energy prices spiking?
Well, in the first instance, we will manage it over the next while. I think the key agenda item for Ireland on the energy front is wind, and we've been great developers of onshore wind. The next decade in Ireland will be offshore wind, and we have streamlined our planning application framework for investors so they have certainty in terms of applying to invest in terms of offshore wind infrastructure in Ireland. So that will be a key agenda item of ours, and renewables. We have a very strong climate component in our government and in our government programme, and that of course is not disconnected from the energy agenda. And there will be challenges of that, there is no doubt, but we are making considerable progress.
Are you worried about the here and now? Are you worried about blackout risks? Are you worried about the amount of consumption data?
Data is taking up considerable demand in energy terms, but we have been robust in terms of meeting that to date.
This week, methane becomes the new focus to slow the pace of global warming. The other greenhouse gas is 80 times more harmful to the atmosphere than CO2.
About a quarter of all the human-caused warming that we've experienced to date is because of methane emissions by humans.
Methane hunters. Activists and scientists sniff for hidden leaks before they cook the planet any further.
The oil and gas industry is not containing their methane gas.
I'm seeing a lot of emissions coming from the tank valves.
And Turkmenistan's gas problem. The Central Asian nation is the world's fourth biggest methane emitter. How can you convince an authoritarian government that climate change matters?
He is almost a parody of a dictator with complete power over every part of that society. Turkmenistan's engagement with international environmental bodies is very minimal.
I'm Kaylee Lyons in New York, and this is Bloomberg Green. A lot of the blame for the climate problem goes to the burning of fossil fuels, which adds carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. The greenhouse gas acts like a blanket, enveloping the planet, raising global average temperatures, and unleashing catastrophes that very few are prepared to deal with. But carbon dioxide, CO2, is only half the problem. As the world heads toward zeroing out the impact of all greenhouse gases, attention will have to be given to all of the gases, and especially methane. Bloomberg's Zachary Miter explains.
If you think about the fossil fuels that are down in the ground, one of the main ones is actually methane. And what we refer to as natural gas is essentially a combination of gases that come up from the ground that are mostly methane, with a few other gases thrown in there. Methane is a super powerful greenhouse gas. It has about 80 times the global warming potential of carbon dioxide over a 20-year period. And scientists think that about a quarter of all the human-caused warming that we've experienced to date is because of methane emissions by humans. We do a lot of different things to put methane in the atmosphere. Raising livestock is a big contributor. Growing rice is another one. Landfills, sewage, there's all different kinds of things. And then, of course, oil and gas.
That was Bloomberg Investigations reporter Zachary Miter. We will hear back from Zachary later on in the program as he followed a group of so-called methane hunters. Well, on June 4th, the European Union's climate czar, Frans Timmermans, gave a speech promoting the world's most ambitious green agenda. The same day, a satellite observed a massive plume of methane from a pipeline connecting Russia and Western Europe. The release had the same short-term climate impact as the annual emissions of 90,000 cars in the UK. It highlights a central contradiction in Europe's energy policy. Despite its lofty ambitions, it remains deeply reliant on pipelines of Russian gas, which are prone to leaking. But solving the problem relies on its detection. We spoke with Klaus Zehner from the European Space Agency about measuring the release of greenhouse gases from far above the Earth.
We are using, at the European Space Agency, we are using space by sending up satellites there in order to look back on what is happening on Earth. Sentinel-5B is a Copernicus Sentinel mission, the first one on atmosphere, and it has on board a spectrometer, which is called Tworbomi. And the spectrometer is just collecting the light that is reflected from the Earth's surface and from the atmosphere, and is comparing this light with sunlight. So what you see within these measurements, when there are trace gases in the atmosphere, you see absorption features because, like methane is absorbing light. Within these measurements, you have absorption features. You compare these measurements coming from Earth with measurements to the sun, that this is outside the atmosphere. So these measurements are not affected by the atmosphere. And you just look at these differences, which are the absorption features. And for example, if you have a huge dip in your measurements, you have a strong concentration of methane. So it's quite a simple technique.
So would your systems pick up any natural methane emissions, or are what you are seeing really all just man-made?
No, what we also see, for example, we see clearly with the Sentinel-5B troponin measurements, we see emissions from wetlands. We have some examples for over Africa. We are also trying to look now in areas if we see emissions from livestock. We are just testing an area over California, but there you also have emissions from oil and gas. So we see emissions of natural emissions, but we also see very strongly emissions coming from oil and gas industry, for example.
So preventing leaks potentially from happening in the future is one thing. It's another thing to stop leaks that are currently happening. When you do these measurements, how quickly could that translate into the plugging of a methane leak?
That's not so straightforward to be answered because there are different cases. We have seen with our measurements, we have seen some leaks, and even sometimes we had to find out who is the company who is responsible, let's say, for this pipeline or for this special oil well. And sometimes we realized that they were not even aware by themselves that based on COVID, there was less maintenance or things going on like this, or there was less usage of methane and more gas has been released. So it's not easy to give a clear message on this, but the important thing is that we provide this information to the people who are responsible where these things are happening, and then depending on where it is it in a pipeline in Siberia, is it somewhere in an area where people are living close by? Then depending on the circumstances, you get the different response time and how to close or to correct for these leaks.
What circumstances do you find most often? Where do a lot of leaks center from?
Yeah, we see really on regular basis, we see leaks over pipelines, and we also see really emissions coming from oil and gas industry. And there are huge areas, for example, in the Permian Basin in the US, where these leaks are happening. Sometimes even methane is coming out and they're even flaring it, and you also see emissions from this. So it's really mainly coming from oil and gas industry. We are also testing Sentinel-5B to look at emissions from waste dump, but these sources are much smaller. We average our data, so we are using kind of time series, and we see sometimes a signal, but it's not so easy to identify where the hotspot is. And we are working together with other companies. For example, there's the Canadian company GHGSat. They are providing only few measurements in space per orbit, but they have a high spatial resolution. So you can combine troponin measurements of methane, and you can use GHGSat measurements to zoom in. And based on this, we have, for example, we have detected methane emission from a waste dump in Argentina, for example. But it's just one example of an application. And it's also important to work together with other first space agencies, but also in this case, it's a commercial agency, but also with ground-based people and with the modeling community. So it's the satellites from ESA, from the European Copernicus program, they are providing a contribution to the general picture. With satellites alone, you don't solve everything, but it's a contribution, and you have to work together to get the information out that is needed in order to be able to mitigate.
All right, Klaus Sainer of the European Space Agency, thank you so much for your time today. Up next, we travel to the Permian Basin, where we follow the methane hunters. A group of scientists and activists are looking for gas spills into the atmosphere before they cook the planet any further. This is Bloomberg Green.
Bloomberg has enhanced search on the terminal to deliver what you need when you need it. Now, you can simply type phrases in everyday English in the command line. Compare financials. Find people. Analyze markets. You can enter phrases or ask questions. What do you want to know today? Ask a question or visit SearchGo to find answers now. Access the financial world on demand. Hear from leading economists, policymakers, and industry experts via live and on-demand webinars, only from Bloomberg. Start exploring to see what's moving the markets. Visit Bloomberg.com/webinars.
I'm Jennifer Zabasaja in New York, and here's everything you need to know in green this week. 3 scientists win the Nobel Prize for Physics for their breakthroughs in how we understand the planet's climate. Syukuro Manabe of Princeton University and Klaus Hasselmann of the Max Planck Institute were awarded half the prize for their climate models. The other half went to a third scientist, Giorgio Parizzi, from the Sapienza University in Rome. Also, rich countries fell $10 billion short in climate finance pledges. Bloomberg sources say that a handful of European nations plan to close this shortfall ahead of COP26. Over a decade ago, developed countries promised to mobilize $100 billion a year by 2020 to help poor countries deal with the worst impacts of global warming. And finally, the world has lost 14% of its coral in just over a decade, mainly due to climate change. A sweeping international report on the state of the world's coral underscores the impact of global warming on coral reefs. But it also says that some of them could be recovered and saved if humans move quickly to rein in greenhouse gases. And that's your Green Brief. Kaylee?
Thanks, Jen. Methane leaks are not just a problem in Europe. Frackers in America's largest oil field are letting massive amounts of natural gas spill into the atmosphere. Scientists and activists are trying to find the leaks and get them plugged before they cook the planet any further. Bloomberg's investigations reporter Zachary Miter followed those methane hunters in the Texan Permian Basin.
Oil and gas industry started this fracking boom. And at first they were encroaching into neighborhoods and into backyards.
Not in our backyard, not in anyone's backyard. Get the frack out of our lives.
Now their emissions, their pollution that they release from these sites is a problem for everyone around the globe because methane is a very powerful greenhouse gas.
The Permian Basin in Texas, it's by far the most productive field in the country. I think more than half the country's drill rigs were operating there over the past few years. And Sharon Wilson goes out there every couple months with this camera that can see methane, this invisible pollutant.
If you could see the emissions with your naked eye, there never would have been a fracking boom. You cannot see it without this camera. I'm a certified optical gas imaging thermographer and a field advocate for earthworks. I use an optical gas imaging camera. It's manufactured by FLIR, which stands for Forward-Looking Infrared.
It's a $100,000 camera that uses infrared sensors to produce an image that shows methane.
I make visible the invisible emissions out here to prove that the oil and gas industry is not containing their methane gas.
I'm seeing a lot of emissions coming from the tank valves. Sometimes the industry will say that's steam. That's just an excuse industry makes. They use the same camera that we use. They don't use it to go find steam.
Sharon was not really an environmentalist. She used to work for an oil services company back in the day. And she had this beautiful place out in the country. She was raising her boys there. And she really blamed fracking for kind of ruining the air and water in her area. And so she became sort of mobilized to do something about it.
When my water turned black, no one came. Because if it has to do with oil and gas, no one's coming. You're on your own. So I didn't want other people to go through that.
A lot of the Permian is just miles and miles away from a public road, and the roads are just kind of built by the oil companies and off limits to the public. And so there's a lot of kind of driving around figuring out how to get places.
I don't see a sign that says no trespassing. I don't know, what do y'all think? All they can do is come at us on their four-wheeler with a rifle.
I didn't know whether we would find any methane. I mean, most of these emissions are evidence of something going wrong. Maybe we'd strike out. But, you know, Sharon has done this a lot. She was pretty confident. And we found lots of events every day. Methane, it's just kind of everywhere.
That's what the camera sees is coming up from the top of the flare, an unlit flare.
It's confounding because, of course, natural gas is a useful fuel that people pay money for. It's not really in anyone's interest to waste it. But gas is very difficult to handle. It's hard to store, it's hard to transport. It's easy for pressure to build up somewhere and you have to release it somehow. If you burn the gas, obviously that's not great for the environment because you're putting carbon dioxide into the air. But releasing it without burning it is something like 16 times as bad because then you're releasing methane rather than carbon.
Volatile organic compounds and methane gas. I wouldn't want to live downwind. Once we have the footage, we submit complaints to the TCEQ, the Texas Regulatory Agency. I've made over 240 complaints, and even if they take action, it doesn't last. But until something changes, we'll keep doing this.
A lot of other people out there are focused on what can we do to clean it up. So Environmental Defense Fund, you could think about what they're doing in the Permian as sort of like dispatching like 1,000 Sharon Wilsons. I went to Austin, Texas to visit David Lyon, who's running EDF's Permian project.
What have you found so far? We found that emissions in the Permian are very high. We find that about 5% of these flares are unlit and venting all the methane to the atmosphere, and about another 5% have combustion problems. So really we have two goals. One is to have the data inform regulators so they can design effective policies. We also want to have actions by the operators in the Permian, so they would make changes to their sites which would minimize the occurrence of those kinds of issues in the future.
If you look at what oil companies are saying publicly, they are saying almost uniformly that they're very focused on this problem.
We're wide awake about the dangers of climate change. We put very stringent targets on methane.
It's absolutely critical that we as a company get this right, and frankly, we as an industry get this right.
We are ready to curb our emissions, and we will do it together.
But in a few years, when the next boom happens, either in the Permian or somewhere else, and there's real money to be made, are they going to show the same restraint that they're pledging right now? Or are they going to focus on the short-term bottom line, which is let's just drill as fast as we can, and who cares if some methane leaks into the air?
I've been hearing their promises for over a decade. It's like forgiving your cheating lover one more time.
Up next, Turkmenistan's gas problem. The Central Asian nation spews methane in huge volumes, and it's yet unclear how its authoritarian government can be persuaded to do anything about it. We'll find out more next. This is Bloomberg Green.
from New York City.
We're in London, in Sydney,
In San Francisco.
9 a.m. in Beijing and Shanghai.
Good morning, everyone.
Have a great evening.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak with Lee.
Balance of Power on Bloomberg Radio.
Welcome to Daybreak Australia.
This is Bloomberg Technology.
And this is Bloomberg Green.
To recap the headlines.
You do not want to miss this story.
Really good news on the jobless claims
How
front.
are you thinking about those dynamics?
From Bloomberg's headquarters in New York, I'm Kaylee Lines, and this is Bloomberg Green. The world has a serious problem with methane emissions from Turkmenistan. In 2020, the International Energy Agency estimated its overall methane emissions were behind only Russia, the U.S., and Iran, all of which have significantly larger energy industries, not to mention much larger populations than the Central Asian nation's 5 million citizens. Yet, unlike those nations, it's not at all clear how Turkmenistan can be persuaded to reduce its climate impacts. Joining us now for more is Matthew Campbell from Bloomberg Businessweek. So, Matt, let's talk about exactly what is happening there. What are scientists detecting?
Well, Kaylee, for a long time, methane emissions were a bit mysterious. They are invisible. They are not well monitored. This is a colorless, odorless gas. It's only in the last few years, thanks to some increasingly sophisticated satellites that are surveilling greenhouse gas emissions, that scientists have been able to really monitor methane in detail. And what they're seeing, particularly in Turkmenistan, is quite alarming. There appear to be some very large releases of methane going on from oil and gas facilities of various kinds. These can be really enormous. One leak that was observed by a company we spoke to, they estimated, or a researcher affiliated with them estimated, that it was equivalent to about 8 million cars driving around for a year. So the carbon impact of even one or two of these leaks can be very large. There is a fair bit of pressure on methane elsewhere, but not in Turkmenistan.
So these leaks can cause very large problems, but what exactly is the cause of the leaks in the first place?
Well, methane leaks from oil and gas facilities in one of three ways. The most obvious are called fugitive emissions, which is basically leaky stuff, old pipes, valves that need to be replaced, things like that. Those are difficult to detect. You might need aircraft or satellites to find those leaks, but you can replace them pretty easily. The two other ways are so-called flaring, which is when you light methane on fire because you can't use it in one way or another, and venting, which is when you just release it into the atmosphere. What is going on in Turkmenistan appears to be more or less venting on quite large scale. And from a climate perspective, that is incredibly worrying.
So let's talk about who and who doesn't care about this. What about Turkmenistan's government? What's it like?
Turkmenistan is one of the most repressive countries, certainly in Central Asia, if not in the world. It's a post-Soviet dictatorship run by a series of kind of strongman leaders, actually run by two strongman leaders since it attained independence from the Soviet Union in 1991. The current president, President Berdi Muhammadov, is really in charge of everything. He is almost a parody of a dictator with complete power over every part of that society. Turkmenistan's engagement with international environmental bodies is very minimal. This is not a country that is persuadable in the way that even some of its Central Asian neighbors would be, because it's just not integrated in international institutions.
So is it then impossible to persuade the government to take action?
Nothing's impossible. And I think in the case of Turkmenistan, there is one very obvious avenue for persuading the government to look at methane emissions more seriously, and that's China. Turkmenistan's natural gas industry, which is one of the largest in the world, essentially has one major customer, which is China. There is one of the large state-owned Chinese oil companies has a big operation in Turkmenistan. The Chinese, if anyone has leverage in Ashgabat, the Turkmen capital, it is the Chinese. Xi Jinping's government has been very aggressive on climate change. And if it wanted to make an issue of methane emissions in Turkmenistan, it probably could. But that's a decision for them.
So if Turkmenistan is to be persuaded, what would they need to do? How do you go about fixing this?
Well, with methane emissions, there are two broad categories of fixes. For fugitive emissions, these are the accidental leaks that can be quite large. You just need to replace stuff. You need to go around tightening nuts and bolts to oversimplify it. As someone said to me, that this is much more in the realm of auto mechanics than rocket science. For flaring and venting, though, you do need to invest in storage and transportation capacity so you have something to do with all this methane that you would otherwise just release. That can be expensive, but it is not technically so challenging.
All right, Matthew Campbell, our Bloomberg Business Week reporter, thank you so much. That's it for this week's edition on the other greenhouse gas, methane, the new focus in the attempt to slow the pace of global warming. Make sure you check out the second part of Methane Hunters on Bloomberg Quick Take this weekend, and Bloomberg Green Magazine's 5th issue will be available from Monday. Plus, you can keep the conversation going by following us on Twitter @Climate. I'm Kaylee Lyons in New York, and this is Bloomberg Green.
The 1972 Madison Square Garden eyelet jumpsuit, which is arguably, from what we're finding out, probably one of the most important jumpsuits of Elvis's entire career. So it marked so many milestones, really, for him. It was used for an album cover. It was used when he performed Madison Square Garden, and he was the first performer to ever sell out 4 nights straight in Madison Square Garden. So he really started that whole thing that we see now in pop culture, where when you make it big, you do Madison Square Garden. So we're super honored to have it. I can honestly say that COVID has been unbelievable for internet-based and e-commerce businesses, because we have a captive audience. We have people home that really want something to do and need entertainment, so we do our best to try to give it to them.
Trading revenues coming in better than expected. Everything cash, $1.4 trillion of cash. One of the most notable aspects of this report that was stellar.
We are 100% confident every time we make the investment that it's going to be a big company. We are wrong a lot of the time. For most forms of investing, the mistakes are the investments you make where you lose money, right? In our world, it's the investments you don't make.
He
made his first fortune by co-founding companies such as Netscape and Opsware. But Mark Andreessen made his name by launching Andreessen Horowitz, the powerhouse Silicon Valley venture capital firm.
We sort of thought it was time to go back to the well, if you will, and basically build a firm that was actually built by founders who sort of understood the process more deeply.
In 2009, Mark and partner Ben Horowitz started their firm with just $300 million. Fast forward to today, it's a top firm with $18 billion in assets under management.
Certainly at the time of their founding, they had made the claim of, hey, we've built multiple huge important companies in the past, and we understand not just what it takes to build it, but the actual angst and the plight of the entrepreneur. And that's what attracted a lot of entrepreneurs to ask them to invest.
Pick a big tech name, and chances are Andreessen Horowitz has invested in it. Twitter, Facebook, Airbnb, Coinbase, Affirm, and the list goes on.
There's plenty of very smart people in Silicon Valley, and he's among the very, very few that just on a different level of intellectual capacity, and he is almost giddily optimistic. He's one of these people that you go to talk to about your problems and come out thinking like, wow, like actually I have it so great.
Mark may be optimistic, but he also knows he can't win every time.
We're trying to do the moonshots. Every once in a while, we're going to have rockets blow up in the launch pad.
Well, let's suppose an entrepreneur says, I've read about Andreessen Horowitz and I read about Mark Andreessen. I'd like them to back my company. How do they get you to back their company? Do they call you up? They knock on the door? They send you an email? What's the best way for somebody to contact you?
So it's a people business, right? It's a very deep personal people connection business. Like a venture capital investment is the closest thing to a marriage that's not a marriage, right? Because it's a 10 or 15 or 20 year relationship. And so you're really trying hard, and I think this applies in both directions. You're really trying hard to figure out exactly who these people are. Are they the kind of people, are we the kind of people they'll want to be in partnership with for a decade, and vice versa? Typically that starts with a warm introduction. It starts with a way to kind of establish a personal connection, kind of between people where you have people vouching for each other. And then there's a process that follows that.
Well, suppose somebody is a terrific entrepreneur on paper. He or she looks great, but they've really never done this before. They seem to have good education. They seem to have the drive. What's the likelihood that you would back somebody who's never done a deal before?
So if they've never founded a company before, and if they just have a plan, it's very unlikely that they raise sort of called top-end venture capital. However, once in a while, you get somebody who's not done it before, but they've already built the product, right? And so the classic example of this would be Facebook. Mark Zuckerberg had already built Facebook at Harvard, right, by the time he started a company. I was an example of this. I had already built the Mosaic browser by the time I started Netscape. And so a first-time founder who has a product, the Google's another example. The Google guys had built the Google search engine at Stanford. And so if you've already built the product, then you have a calling card to be able to raise money for a venture because you already have something that's real. And so the best thing to do as a first-time founder is actually build a product. Now, there's a chicken and egg thing there, which is you might need the money to build the product, and that's where people get stuck.
Okay, let's suppose somebody comes to you and he or she is well addressed. They've come to you from a recommendation by somebody that's good, and they've actually built a product.
Right.
When you look at their deal, do you say, we need to make 10 times our money, 20 times our money, 30 times our money to go forward? How do you assess what kind of profitability you want in order to decide how much you're going to put in and when you're going to do it?
Yeah, so we do some quantitative modeling, especially later stage, but the big question is, could you view a path by which this could be a big, important, independent franchise company for a very long time to come? Like, is this kind of the kernel of something that could grow into being something very important and very large? And if you think that's the case, then kind of the math falls out of that, right? Because almost every time that happens, you end up making a lot of money. So that's really the question. And I would really drill into this concept. We focus a lot on this concept of importance. Like, does this matter? Like this product in the life of its users or customers, like, is it really going to be fundamental? Is it going to matter? Is everybody in whatever market they're in going to need this product? Are people going to find it inconceivable to live without this product? If we have that, then it's very easy to build the spreadsheet. If we don't have that, and it's just basically like, oh, we think Microsoft will buy this company in 2 years or something, then we would not do that deal.
So let's suppose a proposal comes in and you see the fingerprints of Benchmark on it, right, or the fingerprints of Sequoia or another firm, Accel. Do you say, look, you've been turned down by somebody else, we're not interested, or they have to come to you first for you even to consider it?
So I would say there's not. So there's a general sense of heat, right? So there's a general sense. The way I would describe it basically is each top-end venture firm has its own bar. So it has its own set of criteria for kind of whether it thinks a deal should be done or not. And then the top-tier venture firms as a group have kind of a collective bar, which is kind of, is a top-tier venture firm going to fund this company or not? And it's actually easier to answer that second question than it is the first question. Like, after you've been in the business for a while, you tend to have a sense of like, okay, this is going to get funded by a top-end venture capital firm or it's not. If it is going to get funded by a top-end venture capital firm, and if my firm doesn't think it's a good idea, you do wonder, like, who's right? Because the other firms are quite smart. And so this is one of the regular discussions that we have, which is like, okay, if another one of these top-end firms is interested in it, that might be a very positive, substantive signal. If the other top-end firms have looked at it and all passed, that might be a substantive negative signal. That said, some of the best deals in history have been passed on by a very large number of people. One of the classic examples, Uber was passed on by a very large number of venture capital firms. Uber was actually available to be invested in on this site called AngelList, where literally anybody with a checkbook can invest. And so every once in a while you get these outliers, and it's fundamentally a game of outliers. Like the money is made on the aberrations. And so I would say you want to be generally open-minded and humble about your conclusions about what all these different signals mean.
So it used to be the case that venture capitalists, let's say the Silicon Valley ones, would look at something called a Series A. What is a Series A investment?
Yeah, so Series A typically means first institutional money. And so it's sort of like the first step towards sort of being a serious business with sort of a serious lead investor, with a serious board of directors, with a serious amount of money, where basically like there's a real commitment being made around to everybody, or by everybody around the table, that they're going to really devote like a lot of time and effort to making this thing work.
Okay, so when a typical firm like yours does a Series A round, you expect to do a Series B, and then a Series C, and then typically you go public maybe after a Series C. Is that generally the way it used to work?
Well, so the joke is that the goal of every Silicon Valley startup is to get all the way to Series Z, and then every once in a while an accident happens and they go public. That's a joke. Okay. Our goal whenever we back these companies is we want these companies to become long-lived, enduring, independent, standalone institutions. That usually results in them going public at some point. Sometimes they go public after 2 rounds of financing or 3 rounds of financing. Sometimes these days they'll actually stay private for longer and they'll raise 5 or 6 or 7 rounds of private financing. One of the things, the returns have gotten bigger, the wins have gotten bigger. A lot of what's happening is the markets have gotten bigger, right? And so you have this gigantic addressable market for these companies. Now you've got 5 billion people on the planet now with smartphones, right, that are networked together. And so you get one of these companies that has mass appeal. They can get really big. It takes a long time to get that big. It takes a lot of money to get that big, but they have a lot of running. I mean, we have tech companies now that are worth more than $1 trillion. Right, which was inconceivable when I started in the industry. It was just like an impossible thing to visualize. And so some of these companies just end up raising a lot more money than the historical norms would suggest, and they stay private for longer, and then later on they go public.
Why do some people not want to go public?
So the public market is a complex and it can be a very hostile environment. Over time, I think it's fair to say the public market has gotten shorter and shorter term in nature. The marginal investor in the public market is very interested in short-term performance, and the number of investors in the public market that really want to invest for a 10 or 20-year period is not that big. And so you can end up with basically this very tightly compressed time frame as a public company where people are really on you about what you're doing for them kind of this quarter or this year. And so some of these more aggressive entrepreneurs that have a 10 or 20-year vision just kind of think they basically want more flexibility in how they build their business. It's possible there's another cyclical boom and bust cycle. Our plan for that cycle would basically be to just keep going.
Did you make the decision to move to the Bahamas of all the options out there?
We've been looking at the Bahamas for a while. They're one of the first countries to roll out any comprehensive regulation for cryptocurrencies, which we think is extremely important for the space and a really positive sign.
The world of venture capital has blown up in 2021. There's never been another year like it. In the first 6 months, startup investment was $292 billion. According to CB Insights, that's just $10 billion short of the capital deployed in all of last year, which holds the current record. The U.S. has accounted for almost half of that investment. And no surprise, at the top of the charts, Silicon Valley was still the dominant startup market. But a number of other locations in the U.S. also set records: Los Angeles, Chicago, Austin, Seattle, Denver, and Dallas. And there were some familiar names among the leading deal makers. Tiger Global Management was by far the most active investor. It completed an average of more than one deal per business day. Tiger was followed by Andreessen Horowitz and Sequoia Capital China. All that investing has led to a whole new herd of unicorns, startups valued at a minimum of $1 billion. In the first 6 months of the year, 250 companies had joined the Crunchbase Unicorn Board. That's compared to 161 unicorns for all of 2020.
So the venture capital world has been booming. I've never seen anything like this. Is this because people who are venture capitalists are smarter than they used to be? Or because of COVID, everybody is just putting money in the venture things? Why is it so much incredible profits that are being realized by venture capitalists now?
Well, two possibilities. One possibility is we've gotten carried away again. So we've gotten ahead of ourselves again, the same way we did in the late 90s. And things are just are too hot. And that's a possibility. The other possibility is our society is going through a real technological transformation. And it was already going through a transformation before COVID, and I think there's a good argument that COVID has accelerated that transformation. A lot of digital businesses have really accelerated through COVID. And it feels like the world is going to change in some pretty fundamental ways coming out of COVID. And so in that case, you have these new tech companies basically driving this change and realizing the benefits.
Do you worry that because the economy might soften at some point if interest rates are raised, or just because of the business cycle, the wonderful world of venture capital will slow down a bit? And is that a worry for you?
So it's a cyclical business for sure. It has a history of boom-bust cycles, basically just like any other sector of the economy. That said, I guess I would say we do not have a great track record in our industry of predicting these cycles. And I think most of how we either perform or fail to perform is micro, not macro, which is to say it's based on the success or failure of individual companies. And if you just look at the history of venture capital and startups, many of the best companies have been formed during the hot periods, but also many of the companies have been formed during the cold periods, right? And there are pros and cons to those periods. And so, look, it's possible there's another cyclical boom and bust cycle. Our plan for that cycle would basically be to just keep going, keep working with our existing companies, help them through it, keep investing in new companies all the way through, and basically bet on these sort of micro-level, fundamental technological and economic changes that continue to happen.
It seems as if there are no losses anymore. In the old days, venture capitalists would say maybe they'd make money on 10% of their deals and they'd lose money on 90%, or that's roughly how people might have looked at it. Now you seem to make money on everything. Does anything ever fail anymore?
I can confirm that is not the case. We made a commitment. This is true. We made a commitment to our investors when we first raised our fund. I said, look, we're trying to get to the moon. We're trying to do the moon shots. Now every once in a while we're going to have rockets blow up in the launch pad, put a big crater in the ground. And so I am pleased to say we do both of those. The statistical kind of layout of top-end venture capital, if you look at like the 50-year history of it, it's actually about a 50-50 success rate. And this is for kind of top decile venture capital, so kind of where you want to be. But it's basically 50% of the companies make money, 50% of the companies lose money. And then, of course, you need the 50% of the companies that make money to make more money than the ones who lose money. And that's the general statistical breakdown.
But it used to be the case if a venture capitalist did a very successful deal, the venture capitalist might make 4, 10, 15 times its money, her money, his money. Now you seem to make 500 times your money in some cases. So, for example, a deal that your firm did, Coinbase, seems to be one of the most successful venture deals of all time. Was that obvious to you when you made the initial investment?
No, these are not. Well, so we are 100% confident every time we make the investment that it's going to be a big company. We are wrong a lot of the time. These companies are very contingent. We like to say there's a lot of path dependence in the system. There's a lot of twists and turns along the way. Look, a huge part of it is the competence and capabilities of the founders, and then ultimately the CEO of the company. And of course, they deserve 99% of the credit when it works out.
Now, historically, venture capitalists used to price deals at, hoping they get a good rate of return. But a firm like SoftBank has come in with enormous amounts of money and paid higher prices than I think even you would pay or other venture capitalists. Has that helped the business, hurt the business, or is it too early to say?
Yeah, so I'm a market fundamentalist. I have great respect for anybody who's fielding money, where they're taking responsibility for the results. And I don't like to prejudge. I think SoftBank has made some actually very good investments. I would say sometimes that amount of money is very helpful to a company, which is it really helps them kind of bootstrap and get big and scale. Sometimes too much money is very damaging for a company, right? And you can really kind of screw up a company. And I think that's also happening.
So what about Silicon Valley versus other parts of the United States? It seems as if all the big deals are coming out of Silicon Valley. Coinbase, I mentioned, Snowflake, Palantir. These are very successful IPOs that were based out of Silicon Valley firms where they put the initial money in. What about Austin, Boston, New York City? Are they able to catch up with you, or Silicon Valley so far ahead that nobody can catch up?
Yeah, so I think this is a real pre-COVID, post-COVID thing that's happening right now. So pre-COVID, Silicon Valley had a very powerful lock, in particular on the talent. I think COVID, in the post-COVID world, that looks like it's changing pretty dramatically because we've all gotten just so much more used to this whole idea of remote work and distributed companies. And so now you see a lot more motion activity happening outside the Valley. And, by the way, not just in other cities, right? So it's possible that there's a new Silicon Valley in Austin or Miami or whatever. It's also possible Silicon Valley would like to say, just moves to the cloud, right? It's also possible these companies kind of shift to running online. And maybe they run without a central location. So our company, Coinbase, as an example, just went public without a headquarters address, right? They literally declare they took the headquarters address out of their S1 when they went public to make the point that it's now a virtual company, not primarily a physically instantiated company.
So let's talk about the rest of the world for a moment. What about China and India? Are they great potential rivals of Silicon Valley, or they're not really going to be able to compete with what you do?
Yeah, no, and I think they're doing very well. You know, China's been very impressive for the last 20 years or so. They've done very well. You know, like anybody, they have their own challenges. Like, you know, they don't have a perfect system either. So they have their own issues. India has a whole bunch of companies that are doing really well or scaling. I would say both of those countries have very vibrant ecosystems with a lot of very talented people.
Do you invest there?
We don't invest as much there. This is another pre-COVID, post-COVID thing. We historically viewed venture capital as sort of a craft business where you're very hands-on with people who you get to know very well and you partner with for a very long time. And so in the past, we were very worried about trying to do that kind of remotely. But again, like in this new world, we have to revisit that assumption because maybe remote is the default. And I think that's one of the big open questions for how this whole industry is going to work.
Now, one area that your firm has specialized in, though you've done many different areas, but is cryptocurrencies. Many people think that cryptocurrencies are not a real thing and not a great asset category, but you are a big investor in Coinbase, among other things. But I remember coming out here a couple of years ago, you told me you were going to look at blockchain and things related to that, and you obviously have done that. What is it about cryptocurrencies that you think makes it an enduring investment proposition? Yeah, so cryptocurrency is one of these things. It's a little bit like the parable of the blind man and the elephant, which is like people touch it from different sides and people get kind of, I think, distracted and carried away and get kind of energized on these different topics. We view it as fundamentally as a technological transformation. So there's a fundamental technological breakthrough that has actually happened, and it's an area of computer science called distributed consensus. So it's the ability for a lot of basically people and software on the internet to be able to form trust relationships in an untrusted environment. Money is one application of being able to have distributed consensus, but it's only one of those applications. There are many other applications, many other things that people are going to be able to do with this technology. And many of the smartest people in computer science are going into this field, and they're pushing it forward at a really rapid rate. So to us, it looks like it's just the 8th or 9th fundamental architecture change, breakthrough, technological transformation happening in the tech industry. And we take it very seriously because of that. So your view is not whether Bitcoin is good or not, or worth X or Y, it's just that the whole technology that underlying Bitcoin is going to transform the world? These are new kinds of computers. This is the thing that gets very subtle. These are new kinds of, Bitcoin is an internet computer. Bitcoin is an internet computer that's spread out across hundreds of thousands of physical computers all over the world. It's a transaction processing system that runs without any sort of central location. You know, it's like a giant distributed mainframe, and it processes transactions. And out of that transaction processing comes the ability to exchange money. Out of that process comes this token, the Bitcoin token, the coin, that's a representation of value of the underlying system. But it's a complete transaction processing system. Like it's a new kind of financial system. When people invent something, usually, even if they're shy, they might say, well, I did something nice. How come the inventor of Bitcoin hasn't surfaced publicly? So this is one of the most amazing things I've ever seen in my life, which is, I would go a step further. Most people, when they invent something this profoundly breakthrough, they actually don't realize how important it is at the time they invent it. And whoever this person or person, thing, AI, government agency, whoever invented this thing, like they knew the importance of what it was from the very beginning, such that they knew it was important to basically hide their identity. And it's incredibly remarkable that they knew that up. It's like Babe Ruth calling a home run. It's just like amazing that they did that. And then it's doubly amazing that they've been able, whoever they are, they've been able to maintain the secret all this time. The way this market tends to work is there are a set of investors that the best entrepreneurs want to take money from, and then there's a lot of other investors that they don't, and that ends up being the kind of big hinge in the market.
really a reminder, isn't it, just how sensitive the markets are to any commentary about trade. We did see some pressure on the yuan, we did see some pressure on the futures. That is now being reversed.
Watch Bloomberg Surveillance to learn how to look at markets, how to look at trends, and how to look younger.
What do you think, John? Botox, or do I really need to get something done?
I think, Tom, if we just change the style up a little bit.
You think so?
Yeah,
You look
drop
great.
the bow tie. Drop the bow tie.
What, skinny tie?
Yeah. I always say, this is my line, whenever anyone in America has to go at me about a skinny tie. The older you get, the wider it gets.
Oh, really?
Until it becomes a bow tie.
This is a bow tie.
Until it becomes so fat, you just sort of...
We have no exposure to Evergrande, is the short answer. Our own strategy on China for the last several years has been built on building independent credit decisions and credit underwriting.
If somebody wants to invest in venture capital, I guess they could call you up and say, I want to put money in your fund, but it's not that easy to get in your funds because funds in Silicon Valley that are well known are often oversubscribed very quickly. How does a professional investor get into one of your funds? Or how does the average person who's sitting watching this show saying, I want to invest with Andreessen Horowitz, if I can, I'll go with some other firm, but I want to be in a good venture firm. How do you know what a good venture firm is, and how do you get into one of those?
Yeah, so generally they're the ones you can't get into, and so the general rule is it's a bad idea to do this. The venture capital firms that are kind of open for outside money are generally the ones you don't want to invest in. So generally speaking, it's a bad idea. There is a platform that is worth looking at for people who want to learn more, and we are not involved in this, and this is not we're not on this. You can't invest in us through this. This is just an industry observation. There's a platform called AngelList. Where basically angel investors are able to basically take money from people who want to follow their deals. Okay. It's worth looking at. People should go in very cautiously. This is a very speculative area, but it is a thing to explore.
Let's suppose I'm watching this. I say, I hear what you're saying, but I'm going to try to find some venture firm I'll go in. It may not be Andreessen Horowitz or Sequoia, but it'll be okay. I'll try it. I'll learn. What should somebody look for in a venture fund that they're going to invest in? There's a track record, quality of the people, how much money the people in the firm are putting into the deals. What should they look for?
Yeah, so the big thing is the best entrepreneurs get to pick their investors, right? It's the reverse of how most investment markets work, right? So the best entrepreneurs get to select who invests, which venture capital firm invests. And so what you want to pay a lot of attention to is this sort of difference we described between sort of this phenomenon of adverse selection versus positive selection, right? So adverse selection is the deal that I can get into is not the one I want to be in. Right. Positive selection is basically an investor whose brand is magnetic such that the best entrepreneurs will want to be associated with that investor. And the way this market tends to work is there are a set of investors that the best entrepreneurs want to take money from, and then there's a lot of other investors that they don't, and that ends up being the kind of big hinge in the market.
The standard way venture firms work is you commit capital, let's say over a 5-year investment period, something like that. Is that right, more or less?
Yeah, exactly right.
And then the fund just typically lasts maybe 10 years or so?
15. Well, these days longer, so often 15. Often the tail extends out to 20 years because these companies take a long time to develop.
And somebody that invests in a venture fund today should be trying to get rates of return of 20%, would you say, or more?
Top-end venture is sort of 3x net of fees. Ideally, you're hoping for more than that. You're hoping for 5x or more. You're illiquid the entire time, right? So you would hope to get paid for the liquidity.
And today...
So yeah, maybe 20 to 40% if things go well is sort of baseline.
Let's take another subject. Let's suppose somebody says, I don't want to invest in Andreessen Horowitz. I want to be Mark Andreessen. How does somebody become a venture capitalist? What are the skill sets for good venture capitalists? There's a high degree of intelligence, hard work, a lot of luck, dress the right part, don't wear a tie. What are the things that make one a good venture capitalist?
So the highly successful VCs historically are very idiosyncratic. You have people from very different backgrounds. Mike Morris is a former newspaper reporter. John Doerr is a former chip salesman. You've got people with very different. Jim Breyer has more of this kind of blue chip investment background. You have people with very different backgrounds and experiences. And so I think it's some set of skills and some set of knowledge, and then there seems to be a taste component to it that's really hard to measure and really hard to predict.
So let me ask you a few lightning round questions, if I could. Sure. What's the best investment advice you've ever received?
Warren Buffett, probably put all your eggs in one basket and watch that basket. Really know what you're doing. Really deeply understand the nature of what you're investing in, I think.
What's the most common investment mistake that you observe?
I think it's the opposite of that. I think it's people basically, they read about something in the paper, see it on TV, and take a flyer without deeply understanding it.
If I gave you $100,000 tomorrow, what would you do with it?
Put in an S&P 500 index fund. Don't get fancy.
And what mistake have you made in hindsight that you wish you hadn't made in the investment world?
Oh, so this is a very interesting aspect of venture capital. For most forms of investing, the mistakes are the investments you make where you lose money, right? In our world, it's the investments you don't make, right? Because if I make an investment in venture capital, I can make an investment, I can lose I can lose 1x, right? But if I don't make an investment and it goes up 1,000x, then I have to read about it every day for the next 30 years and think about all the money that I didn't make that I could have made. And so all of the big mistakes in my world are mistakes of commission. They're mistakes of not making the investment.
So well, the pleasure of being a successful venture capitalist is what? You enjoy building a company from scratch, or at least helping somebody build it. Is that the great pleasure of being a venture capitalist?
Yeah, you get to be part of the team. With basically when these things work, it's amazing, right? It's tremendous when these things really change the world. Look, the other part is the downside is you don't get to run the companies, right? You're a backseat driver, right? You don't get to you're not the person doing all the work who gets to take all the credit. The advantage is you do get to see all the new things, right? And so you do get a front row seat at this kind of amazing show of all these incredible people with all these new ideas, and that ends up being, I think, a pretty valuable part of it.
OECD nations need to end coal use by 2030, developing nations need to follow suit by 2040, and we need coalitions of solidarity between countries that still depend heavily on coal and countries that have the financial and technical resources to support transitions, because it is essential that no more coal power plants are built.
It's really a reminder, isn't it, just how sensitive the markets are to any commentary about trade. We did see some pressure on the yuan, we did see some pressure on the futures. That is now being reversed.
Might it impact China's growth because it is already slowing? Chinese manufacturers are curbing production. This is the latest shock to global supply chains, already delayed by, port delays, chip shortages, saddled with soaring commodity prices as well.
Well, Haslinda, when we've seen a lot of supply chain disruptions at the beginning of this COVID pandemic, and then, supply chains became resilient and it really moved goods around, especially medical goods and supplies. But now, at this part of the pandemic, we are seeing disruptions again, and discontinuities. And that is because of what we spoke about, the demand that is pent up. And of course, if you have factories slowing down and, not being able to produce as much, that is going to impact growth and the recovery.
Global markets never sleep, so stay connected with Francine Lacqua in London, Matt Miller in Berlin, and Kaylee Lyons in New York. Perspective on the day ahead. Bloomberg Surveillance, Early Edition. Weekday mornings on Bloomberg Television.
Leaders from around the world convene in New York City for the UN General Assembly.
distinguished delegates, please take your seats. The third plenary meeting of the General Assembly is called to order.
To discuss the biggest problems facing their governments.
I'm here to sound the alarm. The world must wake up.
Will we meet the threat of challenging climate already ravaging every part of our world?
The world has entered a period of new turbulence and transformation.
We have an awesome power to change things, and to change things for the better. We have to choose. The world has to choose what kind of awesome we're going to be.
Welcome to a special report, Bloomberg New Economy Leading Through Recovery. I'm Anne-Marie Hordern. World leaders gathered for the 76th United Nations General Assembly in New York City after going all virtual in 2020. Nations discussed and debated some of the most difficult challenges of our time: an ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, extreme weather events brought on from climate change, and growing economic inequality.
Challenges are not in short supply. Fragility, conflict, COVID-19, climate change, the list goes on.
We are on the edge of an abyss and moving in the wrong direction. Our world has never been more threatened or more divided. We face the greatest cascade of crises in our lifetimes.
In my view, how we answer these questions in this moment, whether we choose to fight for our shared future or not, will reverberate for generations yet to come. Simply put, we stand, in my view, at an inflection point in history.
We must show that we are capable of learning and maturing and finally taking responsibility for the destruction we are inflicting, not just upon our planet, but upon ourselves. It's time for humanity to grow up.
We must revitalize the economy and pursue more robust, greener, and more balanced global development.
We have brought forward from 2060 to 2050 our goal of achieving climate neutrality, net zero.
Korea will scale up its climate ODA and set up a Green New Deal Trust Fund with a view to supporting the work of Global Green Growth Institute.
China will strive to peak carbon dioxide emissions before 2030 and achieve carbon neutrality before 2060. China will step up support for other developing countries in developing green and low-carbon energy and will not build new coal-fired power projects abroad.
As leaders discuss curbing the environmental impact we as a civilization are having on the Earth, a devastating report by the United Nations showed that we can no longer stop global warming from intensifying, but we still have a small window to stop it from getting even worse. U.S. Special Presidential Envoy for Climate John Kerry said that China must move quickly to lower greenhouse gas emissions and turn away from coal power to limit the worst consequences of global warming. Kerry spoke with Bloomberg's David Weston.
There's been a lot of talk. What actually has gotten accomplished so far? What specifically has gotten done?
I think more countries are becoming aware they've got to step up their game before we go to Glasgow for the Conference of the Parties meeting. We also have had the United States, President Biden, put on the table a doubling of the amount of money that the United States will do in terms of the $100 billion total that has to be put together. China announced yesterday they will no longer fund coal externally in other countries. So people are taking steps. People are beginning to build some momentum, I think. The question is, will it be enough?
So, as you say, President Biden doubled the commitment from the United States toward the $100 billion. Is that enough? Because I've seen some estimates that say that actually it should be more like $40 billion should be the U.S. share toward that $100 billion.
Well, they doubled the doubling, and I think everybody understands that we have a complicated Congress right now. I think it's what the market will bear. But it's also a significant increase of the United States effort. I mean, President Biden is putting more, about 11 billion plus on the table, and that's an important contribution. Other countries need to also do their part.
Beyond President Biden's commitment of $11.4 billion, you also referred to President Xi having sent a statement to the General Assembly about coal-fired plants and stopping the export of them from China. How far does that go toward what you asked for? You asked him for that, as I recall.
Yes, we've been talking about that since way back in January when I first had my first meeting. This is one of the first issues we raised, is the need to end the foreign finance of coal, the foreign investment of coal. Why? Because as of yet, there's no means of really having clean coal, and it is the creator of the greatest amount of emissions in the world, unabated, as it is in many other countries. So the last thing we needed was any country that's going out and pushing new coal-fired power plants. We have some in America still. We have some nuclear plants in America still. We have 20% of our power in Massachusetts comes from nuclear. Nobody's saying close that now, or nobody, I think, absolutely rational with respect to what the choices are. But we cannot continue to pour emissions into the atmosphere, which only heightens the level of the damage being done. The best scientists have told us we have now about 9 years within which to make the critical decisions and implement them to avoid the worst consequences of the climate crisis. That's what we have to do now.
That was U.S. Special Presidential Envoy for Climate John Kerry, and other leaders at the forefront of this battle spoke to Bloomberg about the impact of climate change, including Alok Sharma, COP26 President, Greek Prime Minister Kyriakos Mitsotakis, and UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres.
We are on the verge of a disaster, and there is a risk of a failure for the COP26. If you look at the last data that was published by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, it was clearly stated that things are getting worse than what it was forecasted, and that we have truly a code red in relation to climate evolution. Either countries understand that we are on the verge of a disaster and change course, many of them, others have done a lot and we have to recognize that, or we risk to have a COP26 that fails and we need to face a catastrophic situation in relation to climate. And I believe that this meeting is a very important meeting for a wake-up call with heads of state and government of developed countries, to make sure developed countries are able to correspond to the commitment made to provide financial and technical support to developing countries, namely the $100 billion per year that should be provided. And also the understanding that the impacts of climate change are so devastating, namely in the developing world, small island development states, African countries, but even in the United States, let's be clear, the impacts are so devastating that we need to have half of the climate finance for adaptation to build resilience of the communities, and for the moment it's only 20%. So there are clear requests to developed countries, and also let's be clear, also emerging economies need to commit to more. Need to be part of the reductions program. And until now, many emerging economies have objectives that are not ambitious enough.
The American forest fires are time zones away. You have a fire recently 13 miles, 18 miles from Athens. You are living fires. You are living record of heat. What do you need from Europe? What do you need from world leaders to jumpstart the climate change debate?
First of all, this is really happening. I'm not talking about climate change. I'm not talking about the real climate crisis.
And the energy, fold it right into energy.
That is hitting especially the Mediterranean very, very hard. Now, we've put in place a very ambitious plan to decarbonize very quickly. And Europe is at the forefront of this effort. As you know, we have a commitment to be climate neutral as a continent by 2050 and to reduce our greenhouse gases by 55% by 2030. What are we doing in Greece? First of all, we're shutting down all our coal-fired electricity plants. We said we would do it by 2028. I think it will be possible to do it by 2025. So we are significantly contributing towards decarbonizing by changing our energy mix. obviously we're adding renewables. And in the interim, we are going to be dependent on natural gas. We're retrofitting our buildings at a very rapid pace. We are putting in place a very ambitious plan to encourage people to purchase electric vehicles. And all that is supported by European funds.
Here to talk about the most significant climate event since the 2015 Paris Agreement is the man behind all of the preparations, Alex Sharma, COP26 President designate.
Over the past year, I have spoken to well over 100 governments. I have made visits around the world, including to China. My friend John Kerry, of course, has also done the same. And I can tell you from all the conversations that I've had is that countries around the world recognize that climate change is a great leveler. It does not recognize borders, and they can see themselves what is happening in their own countries. This isn't just about something that's happening internationally. This is happening in the nations around the world. So they see the reason why we need to work together on this. When I was in China, I had a constructive but very candid set of discussions with colleagues in China, and I made the point to them that they have set out clear ambitions. President Xi Jinping has set out clear ambitions in terms of reducing the use of coal. He's set out ambitions in terms of carbon neutrality, getting to the point where they peak their carbon emissions. What we want to see are two things. One of the detailed policies that deliver on these commitments, and the second, and this is really important, are those commitments in the near term, the 2030 emission reduction targets that every G20 nation, indeed every nation in the world, needs to come forward with. But I think particularly the biggest emitters need to set those out before COP26.
Leading through recovery takes innovation while looking for solutions. Ireland's Prime Minister, Michael Martin, discussed how his country is dealing with climate risks with Bloomberg's Caroline Hyde.
Talk to us about net zero by 2050. Will Ireland achieve it?
Yes, and we've passed a climate law in Ireland, which sets very ambitious targets of reducing emissions by about 51% by 2030 and net zero by 2050. And that is a very strong commitment of ours across every sector. And by the end of the year, we will be publishing carbon budgets for each individual sector, from transport to agriculture and to industry. And we have to move fast as a country, and we have set very challenging targets, but we are absolutely determined with our European Union colleagues to achieve them.
Coming up, fighting the COVID-19 pandemic around the world.
What we need is a global vaccination plan. And to have a plan, we need to have leading that plan those that have power. And those that have power are the countries that produce vaccines.
That's ahead on our special report, Bloomberg New Economy, leading through recovery.
What have we learned from this evergreen crisis so far?
From my investment perspective, I think diversification is very important. So far this year, we see many events, right? Maybe in the fintech sector, and education, casino, and property. So I think diversification helps you lower your risk on your overall portfolio.
Medium term, though, are you seeing more risk and reward in the high yield space in Asia? I mean, how are you viewing this right now? Are there actually buying opportunities given just the selling we've seen?
This time is a bit different in the property cycle, because in the last, when you see there's a tightening measure, there's always demand there, right? Just the government trying to suppress the demand. But this time we're seeing a confidence issue, is like a buyer strike. Because of the sentiment, the evergreen is hurting the sentiment, and people don't want to buy. And other developer, because they want to get cash.
Google is saying it has accelerated innovation in the country, and it's planning to appeal the FTC's decision. What's your take on this, and how do you plan for further scrutinies?
We are going to see what they make, and
what changes they actually bring to this market.
Welcome back to our special report, Bloomberg New Economy, Leading Through Recovery. The World Health Organization urged leaders attending the United Nations General Assembly to guarantee equitable access to COVID-19 vaccines. The WHO said vaccinating 40% of every country's population by the end of 2021 and 70% by mid-2022 is achievable with genuine commitment to vaccine equity. Bloomberg's Tom Keene and Kayleigh Lyons spoke with the president of the World Bank, David Malpass, about COVID inequality.
It's $7 a dose to get a vaccine. Why can't we vaccinate Africa?
Yeah, this is on everyone's mind, and it's frustrating. The excess in the advanced economies. I'm chair of a task force that includes IMF, WTO, and WHO, and so there are 2.4 billion excess doses in the advanced economies. Wow. So the goal would be to have those early doses, the early deliveries, go to developing countries that can use those particular doses. You know, it's a hard logistics problem because you've got to get the dose from the factory to a country that wants that kind of dose. So some want mRNA doses, some want AstraZeneca, some want J&J, and so on down the list. And then they sit in a warehouse and they're not applied to people. And that, I think, has to be improved. We're urging, and the task force is urging, the advanced economies to allow a swapping of doses. So if they have a delivery scheduled into their warehouses in October of this year or November of this year, allow that dose to go to a developing country person and take a later delivery schedule because you don't need it. You've got excess 2.4 billion doses.
Yeah, David, it's an excellent point. We're having a conversation now about boosters here in the U.S. when there's many people throughout the world who have yet to receive their initial dose. Do you need the Biden administration to take more leadership on that?
Hi, Kayleigh. I think the world has to come together and find solutions to this problem. And the boosters countries are going to want to do that as needed in order to protect their population. That still leaves huge amounts of excess doses, even in near-term deliveries. What we're working on right now is trying to get November and December deliveries scheduled so that the countries can prepare to deliver that kind. You need a specific kind of cold storage or of trained personnel on each kind of vaccine, and we need much higher numbers of vaccinations in developing countries, and especially the poorest countries.
With the pandemic still spreading throughout the world, booster shots in wealthier nations have become a controversial topic. Ecuador President Guillermo Lasso, Austrian Chancellor Sebastian Kurz, and UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres says to solve the problem, we must come together.
What we need is a global vaccination plan. And to have a plan, we need to have leading that plan those that have power. And those that have power are the countries that produce vaccines or can produce vaccines if they have licenses and technical support for that, to bring them together with international financial institutions and the World Health Organization, able to deal with the pharmaceutical industry and then solve the problems, intellectual property and others, and of course paying what is needed, because obviously the pharmaceutical industries are not philanthropic organizations, we know that, but to have a global vaccination plan which implies doubling the production capacity, which can be done. We see AstraZeneca produced in different places. I believe even Pfizer now made an agreement with a country to produce there. But this can be done systematically. Wherever there is a capacity to produce vaccines, vaccines should be produced. And conditions should be created for that. And doubling the production of vaccines and then having a mechanism of distribution that is equitable. That's what we need. Of course, we have all the problems that we mentioned and many others of the present situation, but these are all small aspects of a bigger one. And the bigger one is we cannot deal with this with vaccine nationalism or vaccine diplomacy, or we need to deal with this with a global vaccination plan and bring together all those that have the power to solve the problem.
But do you think there is something
problematic about the booster shots that are now spreading throughout the
I'm
developed
not a technician, of course. If to have booster shots in one country means that others will not have shots, of course, this is not the best way to deal with the disease. If the booster shots are not used, and then the vaccines go to the as we have seen in many things, to the containers of garbage, then of course the problem is different. But the central question is we need a global vaccination plan. We need to double the capacity of production that exists today and to have a mechanism of equitable distribution, and those that have the power related to this need to come together.
This diplomacy started from a fundamental idea. Health has no ideology, and as soon as I won the elections, I met with the ambassadors of the US, China, Russia, and the European Union to address the need to obtain vaccines. And we were successful with the collaboration of the United States, China, and countries such as Spain, Canada, and even countries like Chile, with a small donation.
Unfortunately, we still have the situation that many countries do not have enough vaccines. So not all the countries are present here at the moment. And my main focus is still on the fight against the pandemic. I think we have to support all the countries in need through COVAX and other initiatives so that we are able to fight the pandemic worldwide and not only in the rich countries like the US, Europe, and some others.
Coming up, to fight the world's most urgent crisis, we must come together. But can it be done? That's ahead on our special report, Bloomberg New Economy, Leading the Recovery.
How far will the Bloomberg surveillance team go to get the inside story?
The UK will deploy its reserve tanker fleet this afternoon.
There we go.
Tom McKean and I might be part of the reserve fleet that gets deployed.
This is more complex than people think. The steering wheel's on the wrong side of the truck. That's the first thing.
Oh, my God.
Thank you to the gentleman out on Twitter that captured this moment.
Wait, question.
Wonderful.
Who of you has a driver's license?
You don't need that.
Every Friday with 30 minutes dedicated to fixed income, I'm Jonathan Ferro. This is Bloomberg Real Yield.
We have a surge in demand. As you know, we had a lot of fiscal support, and that's, we've passed the peak, and that means it will also fade away.
We're not seeking, say it again, we are not seeking a new Cold War or a world divided into rigid blocks.
It's not the time to blame the others. It's the time for everyone to do everything possible to assume their responsibilities.
I'm confident the United States and China can reach agreement on some tricky economic issues. We've done it previously. I'm sure we can do it now, and we've got a good team poised to have those discussions.
We're now joined by Bloomberg New Economy editorial director Andy Brown. Andy, we heard from Biden talking about we're not on the brink of this cold world, and he said, let me say it again. But many would disagree.
Well, it certainly looks as though we're on the brink of a Cold War. The sale of U.S. nuclear submarines to Australia recently, I think, demonstrates that the U.S. and China are locked in geopolitical competition right now. And I guess one of the big questions is whether or not they can transcend that competition to work together on some of these big existential issues, of which by far the most important is climate change, but also control of pandemics.
And Bloomberg will be hosting the New Economy Forum in Singapore. What's the expectation?
It's interesting that the conversations that have been swirling around New York during United Nations General Assembly Week are very similar to to the kind of conversations that we're going to be having in Singapore. And fundamentally, these conversations are linked to the whole issue of a collapse in global trust as a result of the COVID pandemic. Trust is at an all-time low, and that's the implication of some of the comments that we just heard from global leaders, including the United Nations Secretary General. Trust between the developing South and the industrialized North, trust among countries, trust in global institutions, trust by populations in government to do the right thing when it comes to climate change. And, you know, one of the most dramatic, tragic manifestations of this absence of trust is the fact that, yes, we are talking about booster shots for vulnerable populations in rich countries when you have a continent the size of Africa that is still largely unvaccinated. That's the kind of gap that leads to this shredding of global trust.
An absolute deficit. And the WHO wanted to put a moratorium on boosters until there was higher numbers in these developing world. So how do we fix it?
Well, that's the topic of really, that's the theme that's going to be running through our deliberations at the Bloomberg New Economy in Singapore. And we're going to be looking at it through the prism of supply chains, technology, of global institutions, of data, the capital markets. But most importantly, to get back to this trust issue, how do we rebuild international trust? Look, you know, in the absence of trust, absolutely nothing gets done. So, you know, bringing together leaders from developing countries and developed countries to talk about this problem, to reestablish habits of cooperation, to figure out how you can get the world collaborating, uniting against climate change, that really is the essential work of our forum.
Andy Brown, thank you so much for your time. You've been watching a special report, Bloomberg New Economy, Leading Through Recovery. I'm Anne-Marie Hordern.
A market that over the past few weeks has made it clear it wants to go higher. It got a little spooked by the idea that geopolitical tensions are rising.
stocks are very much here to stay.
You can trade anything as a trend follower.
When you think about Bitcoin, I don't think it's a currency. I think it's a commodity.
Today, we're in an everything bubble.
I'm Eric Schatzker, and welcome to Bloomberg's Front Row. Today, I'm talking to the hedge fund hotshots who founded Diameter Capital, Scott Goodwin and Jonathan Lewinson. They invest in credit, everything from investment grade to distressed, making bets on whether borrowers will or won't repay their debts. Diameter is a new breed of hedge fund built for modern markets where speed is the difference between winning and losing.
If you look at how Tiger's disrupting venture with, frankly, speed of capital, or what's happening with Owl Rock disrupting private credit, it's speed of capital.
Speed of capital is really what matters. You don't have time anymore in an environment to sit for weeks and think about it.
Diameter is growing fast too, from $0 to $9 billion in just 4 years. Scott, Jonathan, and I discuss why they're returning some hedge fund capital to clients, how they've produced some of the best returns in credit, a business plan that gets Diameter to $30 billion, the key themes behind their trades, including ESG. Here's my conversation with Scott Goodwin and Jonathan Lewinson. You guys have built one of the hottest hedge fund businesses on the planet, and you've done it in credit, right? At a time of historically low yields, fleeting distress, zombie borrowers, all in the space of 4 years. How?
Well, I guess that goes back to 2010 when we first met at Anchorage Capital. We worked together beneath Tony Davis and Kevin Ulrich and Dan Allen, who ran the firm. John's background is in research and restructuring, mine's in risk and trading. I think we quickly realized working together that combination of risk and trading and research and restructuring worked really well together versus his background in research and my background at Solomon City in just trading and risk. It was very powerful. And eventually we got to the point where we thought we could do our own thing. He had a little interlude at a different firm. But when I left Anchorage in 2016, we were ready to do it.
What we learned day one is we have very different skills. And we're in an environment where more and more everyone wants to say, you just do this. You do a narrow thing. And what Scott and I love to do is we love to look across the entire credit spectrum, from investment grade to new issue, stressed and distressed. And I come from a place where we tend to do lots of deep value work, thinking about restructuring. Scott came from a place where maybe you held positions shorter. And we realized that, and this is the pitch to investors that got us in business, that there weren't many firms, there are many great firms that do aspects of this, but there weren't a lot of firms that were offering investors a investment in credit. Some years it's investment grade, sometimes it's new issue, other times it's shorting, other times it's restructuring and taking over companies in one package that was large enough to be relevant to banks and advisors, but also small enough to be nimble. And that trading and research, by the way, the personalities don't always work. Sometimes traders and analysts don't like each other. We like each other. I think our pants are even the same color today. That was a key part of it, but offering that trading and research together has allowed us to not only pitch something that worked to LPs, but then make it a reality.
If I had gone to your clients, whether they're institutions, whether they're high net worth people, whatever, back in 2017, and asked them what they thought, I know what they would have told me. They would have said the last thing the world needs is another credit hedge fund.
Yeah. They did. In fact, the joke we made was the world would rather have a global epidemic, we said, than a credit hedge fund. So we should probably retire that now. But that's what kind of made it work. What we're doing is a little bit of a throwback. We believe that there are inefficiencies in markets, in trading, and that if you are able to be native across these markets, you'll be able to more quickly understand where the dislocations are. And so in pitching that a little bit of a throwback and pitching a hedge fund, which in many ways was a dirty word. Today we manage a number of different products, but saying we're going to do that. We're going to provide you something that is not as volatile as the markets and that is more smooth. And in down markets, hopefully we do well. Was something they hadn't heard in a while, and we're lucky that some people took a chance.
Maybe we're a little bit more proactive and aggressive in terms of getting research done ahead of events versus reacting to the event and doing the research after the event. But it's combining that trading and research with speed, which we think speed is really alpha in credit. You have a discontinuous market structure. So how do you engage in a discontinuous market structure with speed? You have to know a lot of names. So we have a 20-person analyst team here that many of whom have worked with us previously that help us know a lot of names. And if we know a lot of names and we combine the risk and portfolio management functions, which is what we've done and that I do a lot of the trading as well, then we can react quickly when a mutual fund needs to sell a block of bonds, because Fidelity or BlackRock or PIMCO, the big mutual fund complexes, if they might have an outflow and they want to sell, the banks are no longer bidding on a couple 100 million bonds. They're calling us or maybe one or two other counterparties that can react in 5 minutes, because we have a proactive process where the research is done up front and we know the names. We can respond in seconds. We don't have to go through the junior trader, then the senior trader, then the junior analyst, then the senior analyst, the junior PM, the senior PM, layers and layers and layers and layers and layers of frankly bullshit, pardon my French, to make that decision. We can make it fast.
This is a new firm. We only started investing on September 1st, 2017. We have the benefit of taking our skill set and our team's skill set and kind of molding it for the current environment, for the current state of credit markets, for the post-Volcker world, and for the world now post-COVID. Part of what we think separates us from many of our competitors, even though many of them are great, is this combination of knowledge and speed. Speed of capital is really what matters. You don't have time anymore in an environment to sit for weeks and think about it. And in some degrees, you see private equity firms oftentimes wanting to get into credit when it's interesting. But their cultures are set up to be slow because they swing infrequently, and it doesn't always work. We've set up a culture that says, do your work ahead of time. Have a huge amount of work in the preparedness and less amount of process in the decision making. And that, we think, works with our skills, but also is designed for today's markets and really builds on what we've learned from many people who have come before us.
If you look at how Tiger's disrupting venture with, frankly, speed of capital, or what's happening with Owl Rock disrupting private credit at speed of capital. So all these markets that have discontinuous liquidity, speed of capital matters because most people provide slower capital. If you can provide speed of capital with knowledge, not just provide speed of capital without the research, then you can have an advantage in an environment that's highly competitive.
Now you're returning some of your capital to clients and you're raising fees. How come?
So we'd always size constrain it. We'd close multiple times. We were actually closed when COVID started and we reopened and took money in. But now we're going to return about 10% of the capital at the end of the year, which will bring the fund into the 5 and change billion range from the mid sixes. And we think that sets us up to grow into that capital base again. And if it happens again in the year where the market environment hasn't changed, we'll return capital again. We want to size capital to maximize returns on a risk-adjusted basis. That's something we've committed to our day one LPs. And in terms of the fees, we want to be competitive. We need a lot of people to run our strategy. And we're competing with people who have, frankly, much larger businesses.
Our business, certain of our strategies just don't work if you have to make massive investments all the time. And this idea, we want people to think about diameter. We want you to think about big enough to be relevant, small enough to be nimble. And the second we feel that nimbleness is compromised, we're not running the strategy that we want to run. It becomes someone else's strategy, and frankly, we wouldn't be as good at it. We have tests that we use, and like anything, it's quantitative and qualitative. Can we move 1% position quickly, long and short? Can we, partnering with banks and issuers on new issue is an important part of our business that we can get into. We don't like using leverage, and so we like doing a lot of new issue in bull markets. Can we get enough of that for the fund size?
Lots happening on Wall Street.
It's the basic law of economics.
The Fed is telling us this is transitory.
Need to catch up?
This is Bloomberg Wall Street Week. I'm David Weston.
We've got the information and insights.
David, you just hit the nail right on the head.
From businesses most influential and instrumental.
And that's the way you run good risk management.
But we need to invest in our systems.
Bloomberg Wall Street Week premieres Friday with replays all weekend on Bloomberg Television and Radio.
Bloomberg has enhanced search on the terminal to deliver what you need when you need it. Now, you can simply type phrases in everyday English in the command line. Compare financials. Find people. Analyze markets. You can enter phrases or ask questions. What do you want to know today? Ask a question or visit SearchGo to find answers now.
Some people I know are baffled by your returns. They say there's nowhere near enough ways in credit today to generate that much alpha, especially running as little leverage as you do. So what's the secret? How does the magic happen?
So, I mean, it's knowing the names first, right?
You really believe that is, well, that's a dividing line between you and others?
Everybody can know the names, okay?
But no, not everyone does.
But knowing them early and knowing a lot of them versus knowing them after they go down. Think about it. Most of credit is rules-based. You have investors who either have a ratings constraint, a duration constraint, or a liquidity constraint.
Mutual funds, for example.
Mutual funds, others, CLOs, right? We manage CLOs. They have tons of constraints on them, and we abide by those constraints. But if you have a universe of names you know, and then you can apply that to all markets, investment grade, levered loans, high yield, stress, distress, structured credit, at any given time. In 2011, it was Meredith Whitney blowing up the muni market, right? And be agnostic to where you go on a risk-adjusted basis and be fast because you have a trading mentality that is in your portfolio management process. That's what differentiates it. And it's in this environment, like people are going to say again, there's nothing to do in credit, right? Diameter's returning capital, but there is stuff to do. We just think we want to size our core hedge fund product to do it well. What is there to do right now? Well, you had a pandemic, huge recession. A lot of companies did very poorly for 6 to 12 months. Now they're doing well. Some are having record earnings. Enterprise values are higher than they were pre-COVID. Those companies that were junked are going back to investment grade. There's an ARB because when you go from BB to BBB, the number of buyers, the universe expands exponentially. So if you own the company as BB and you think that S&P or Moody's is going to upgrade it, like Netflix is a position for us right now that we think will get upgraded, there are going to be more buyers of Netflix and those bonds will tighten. And maybe that isn't a money multiple opportunity, but it's a high Sharpe, high IRR opportunity. Capital markets. There's record M&A right now. We have capital markets bankers calling us asking to lay off risk because they want to do more deals. So A, we can help them lay off that risk. We can participate in those deals, learn new names. Those are the opportunities. And credit dispersion was record lows first half of the year. Now it's starting to come back.
You looked skeptically when we said know the names. Why can't everyone know the names? It's an efficient market. You can't, think tanks don't work in finance. By the way, I don't know that they work that well in Washington, but that's again another story. Think tanks don't work here. So if you don't have a mandate to buy investment grade bonds or to buy new issue high yield bonds, you are not going to know them. If you don't have a mandate that includes shorting businesses occasionally, you're not going to know businesses that are in the decline. So when the crisis hits, whether it's oil and gas collapsing in 2014 or 15, or it's even at the end of 18, when there was a scare on interest rates and markets sold off, or of course the global pandemic that we went through. If you haven't invested in the names previously, you're not going to do it again. Because what do people do? When you are afraid, when the market sells down, unless you're a total psycho, unless you're the guy in free solo whose brain is different than the rest of us, you're going to be afraid too, right? Because the market is trading off for a real reason. There is a global pandemic. Okay? So you're not going to buy something you've never heard of. You're going to go back to what you know. But if you've only been looking at crappy companies, let's say that's your mandate, then you'll buy things that went from 75 to 50. We think oftentimes they go to 0. So it's our mandate of always looking at a lot of things, not having a think tank, always finding ways to invest in it with one team that allows us to constantly find what Scott talked about, the return available in credit.
What are you 3 years from now, 5 years from now?
Hedge fund, $5 to $7 billion. CDOs, $1 billion to $1.5 billion. Because there's a cannibalization effect there with the hedge fund, so we size constrain that business. CLOs in the U.S. 8 to 10. CLOs in the U.S. in Europe, maybe 2 to 3. Structured credit long only business potentially. That's a couple billion. And then we think about what's happening in markets and we want to adapt our business. And we think that eventually private credit's a business that we'll be in. I'm not going to put a size on it. But we see what the private equity guys are doing. We're getting more and more calls from them, especially on second liens, where we've worked a lot with Thoma Bravo, for instance, to originate a second lien paper with them. We think that there's a real convergence in the credit space that we focus on not the really small cap stuff, but mid and large cap, where we'll have an opportunity to be in that business as a complementary business to what we're doing elsewhere.
If I add all those numbers up together, it's big. I get to north of 20, maybe 25.
Yeah, 30, maybe. Yeah, we'll see. But you're only as good as your last trade. We got to keep making money in our core products first, and the other stuff will come along.
4.5 years ago, we were in a windowless room. We remember that every single day.
Have you thought out a strategy yet for private credit?
Whether we do it in a small scale or a large scale, we're still discussing, but it's a business that you'll see us in over the next few years because it's really synergistic with what we're doing, and we want to provide those capital solutions when issuers, companies come to us and they say, well, we want a private and a public solution. We want to be able to provide that, whether it's working with the banks or working with the private equity sponsors that we do a lot of business with.
And we want to know more names. And so it's not something that was on the page, though, to your point. 5 years ago in Bubbies, we're not thinking that way. The market is changing, that dynamic is changing. CLOs are growing like crazy, so there's people need public paper too, but that's why we're thinking about it.
You have to adapt, you have to be nimble, and the market's telling us right now that that's a business that we eventually need to be in.
I want to ask you about regulatory issues. Gary Gensler, the SEC chairman, is turning his withering gaze on corporate bond trading. He told senators he wants more efficiency and he wants more transparency in what historically has been an illiquid and opaque market. What could he do?
That to make the credit market look a lot more like the equity market would be a massive, massive overhaul. Doesn't mean that you can't do things to bring it closer and to protect investors who are today not being appropriately protected to the extent that exists. But I think it also highlights a really important difference. Scott mentioned it earlier. Credit investors are generally rule-based investors. You're looking at what's the rating, what's the industry, what's the geography. And certainly there are rules-based investors in equities to some degree, but it's such a different product. Equity markets forcing you to think so much forward-looking, whereas credit markets oftentimes are thinking, what were the last 12 months' earnings? That there are probably really good ways to reform credit, many of which we haven't even thought of, that don't necessarily say just copy what you see in equities.
You go long and short in the hedge fund. Mm-hmm. Do you think of shorting as a hedge or a source of alpha?
Shorting is controversial. My dad was an equity research analyst, and he used to say to me that shorting is un-American to some degree. He's an investor in the hedge fund now, so maybe he's come around. But we really believe that so much time, so much on television, is thinking about who are the winners? Right? Who's going to have the best payment app? Who's going to have the best electronic vehicle? And a big part of what we offer investors in thinking about shorting is sometimes finding the losers is easier, and finding them before it happens in capital structures that are hard to move around. And so we really think that building our business to think about where is there technological transformation, where is there policy volatility, and where is there a lot of debt? First it was oil and gas led in terms of debt, then healthcare led in terms of debt. Now I think it's technology that learns in terms of issuance. Basing our business around that to learn those companies not only produces a return shorting, but we turn around a lot of times and then buy them later when they're at a lower dollar price and help fix the businesses or work with people to fix the business.
We've had too many shorts the past year.